Ever wondered what happens at Dot's Diner after dark? You might think you know, but when the night shift starts, something truly creepy takes over. And trust me, it's not just the irradiated coffee. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the job posting. In the capital Wasteland, finding steady work is like finding clean water, rare and precious. So when I stumbled across that faded recruitment flyer taped to the bulletin board outside Megaton, advertising night shift positions at Dot's Diner, I didn't ask questions. The pay was too good, the hours seemed manageable, and honestly, after months of scavenging bottle caps just to survive, the promise of regular meals was enough to make me overlook the fine print. The flyer was weathered, its edges curled and stained with what I hoped was just rust. Night shift available. It read in bold, blocky letters. Dot's Diner, where every meal is an adventure. Below that, in smaller text that I barely glanced at, must be willing to follow all establishment rules. No exceptions. Serious inquiries only. At the bottom, an address and a time. Report to manager at 6 p.m. sharp for orientation. Dot's Diner had always been something of a landmark in the Wasteland. Every traveler knew about it. That retro-futuristic structure with its distinctive neon sign that somehow still flickered after all these years. During the day, it was a bustling hub of activity. Traders, mercenaries, and settlers would stop by for a quick meal and gossip. The diner served as an unofficial information exchange, where news traveled faster than radroaches and rumors were currency. The daytime staff was friendly enough, serving up surprisingly decent food considering the circumstances of our world. But as the sun began to set, something changed about the place. I noticed it during my few visits as a customer, how the regular patrons would finish their meals quickly as darkness approached, how conversations would die down to nervous whispers, how even the most hardened Wasteland veterans would glance nervously at the windows as shadows grew long. By the time full darkness settled over the Wasteland, the diner would be empty except for the staff, and even they seemed eager to finish their shifts and disappear into the night. The building itself seemed to transform after dark. What appeared cheerful and inviting during daylight hours took on an altogether different character when the only illumination came from the flickering neon sign and the dim fluorescent lights inside. The chrome fixtures that gleamed warmly in sunlight now cast harsh, angular shadows. The red vinyl booths that looked so inviting during the day seemed to absorb light, creating pools of darkness that your eyes couldn't quite penetrate. I arrived at exactly 6 p.m. that first evening, my stomach tight with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The diner looked different than I remembered from my daytime visits. The neon sign buzzed and crackled overhead, casting an eerie red glow across the empty parking lot. Through the windows, I could see a lone figure moving behind the counter, presumably the manager I was supposed to meet. The door chimed as I entered, but the sound seemed muffled, almost swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere inside. The man behind the counter looked up at me with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. He was tall and thin, with graying hair slicked back, and a uniform that looked like it had seen better decades. His name tag simply read M. Gray. "You're here about the night shift," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice carried a weight that made me want to turn around and walk right back out. But the promise of steady pay kept my feet planted. "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I saw the flyer. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze seeming to look right through me. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Good. We've been short-staffed lately. The night shift isn't for everyone, you understand. It requires a certain type of person, someone who can follow instructions without question, who can keep their mouth shut, and who won't go running at the first sign of trouble." Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but I nodded anyway. "I can handle it. We'll see," he said, pulling out a clipboard from behind the counter. "Before we go any further, you need to understand that working the night shift at Dot's Diner comes with certain requirements, rules that must be followed to the letter. No exceptions, no questions asked. Break these rules, and well. He paused, his lips curling into what might have been a smile, but looked more like a grimace. Let's just say the night shift has a high turnover rate. The way he said it made my blood run cold, but I was committed now. I needed this job, needed the stability it promised. Whatever these rules were, I told myself I could handle them. After all, how difficult could working at a diner really be? Mr. Gray handed me the clipboard, and I looked down at what appeared to be a standard employment contract. Most of it was typical legal jargon about wages, hours, and responsibilities. But at the bottom, in bold red letters, was a section titled Night Shift Operational Procedures, Mandatory Compliance Required. Read this section carefully, Mr. Gray instructed, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. These aren't suggestions. They're survival instructions. Every person who's worked the night shift successfully has followed these rules without question. Those who didn't, he trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like smoke. I started reading, and with each line, my unease grew. The rules seemed bizarre, almost nonsensical. Why would a diner need such specific, rigid procedures for a night shift? But Mr. Gray was watching me intently, and I could feel the weight of his expectations. I signed the contract, telling myself that I was overthinking things, that every workplace had its quirks. Excellent, Mr. Gray said, taking the clipboard back. Your first shift starts tomorrow night at 11 p.m. I suggest you get plenty of rest during the day. The night shift can be demanding. And remember, once you start, you're committed for at least 1 full week. Company policy. As I walked back to my ramshackle shelter that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just signed something far more significant than an employment contract. The way Mr. Gray had looked at me, the emphasis he placed on those rules, the strange atmosphere of the diner after dark, it all felt wrong somehow. But I pushed those doubts aside. I needed this job, needed the caps it would provide. Whatever strange procedures the night shift required, I was confident I could handle them. After all, I'd survived raiders, super mutants, and radiation storms. How dangerous could serving coffee and pre-war food really be? That night, as I lay on my thin mattress staring at the rusted ceiling of my shelter, I tried to remember exactly what those rules had said. But strangely, the details seemed fuzzy, like trying to recall a half-remembered dream. All I could remember clearly was Mr. Gray's voice, echoing in my mind. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine. Break them, and, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of flickering neon signs and empty diners where shadows moved just beyond the edge of vision. And somewhere in those dreams, I could hear the sound of that door chime, playing the same 4 notes over and over again, like a funeral dirge welcoming me to something I didn't yet understand. The next evening, I arrived at Dot's Diner with 15 minutes to spare, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed through the front door. The transformation from day to night was even more pronounced than I'd remembered. The cheerful retro atmosphere had given way to something that felt almost predatory, as if the building itself was watching me with hungry eyes. Mr. Gray was waiting behind the counter, but he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, maybe in her 30s, with hollow eyes and prematurely gray streaks in her dark hair. She wore the same uniform as Mr. Gray, but hers looked like it had been through hell, stains that no amount of washing could remove, tears that had been hastily mended, and burns that looked suspiciously like they came from something other than kitchen accidents. "This is Sarah," Mr. Gray said without preamble. "She'll be training you tonight. Sarah's been working the night shift for, how long now?" 3 months, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. When she looked at me, I saw something that made my stomach clench. Pity. She was looking at me the way you might look at a lamb being led to slaughter. "Sarah will explain the rules in detail." Mr. Gray continued. "Pay attention to every word. Your life may depend on it. With that cheerful proclamation, he disappeared into the back office, leaving me alone with Sarah and the growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. Sarah motioned for me to follow her behind the counter. The kitchen area was larger than it appeared from the dining room, stretching back into shadows that the overhead fluorescent lights couldn't quite penetrate. Industrial refrigerators hummed against the walls, and the grill's surface gleamed like a metallic mouth waiting to be fed. "First rule," Sarah said, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of someone who'd recited these words many times before. "The no talking rule. Between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m., no employee is permitted to speak above a whisper. Not to customers, not to each other, not even to yourself. This isn't about noise levels. It's about something else entirely. Something that listens." I wanted to ask what she meant by that, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She continued, "During those hours, if a customer enters and tries to engage you in conversation, you nod, you smile, you serve them, but you don't speak. Most of them understand. The ones that don't." She paused, staring at a stain on the floor that looked disturbingly dark. "The ones that don't usually don't stay long anyway. What happens if you break the rule?" I managed to ask. Sarah's hand unconsciously went to her throat, where I now noticed faint marks that looked like fingerprints. "You don't want to know. Trust me on that. Just don't break it." She led me to the walk-in cooler, its metal door gleaming under the harsh lights. "Second rule, the no leaving rule. Once your shift starts at 11 p.m., you cannot leave the diner for any reason until 6 a.m. Not for a smoke break, not for fresh air, not even if the building is on fire. The doors will lock automatically at 11:05, and they won't unlock until dawn. If you try to force them." She gestured to a section of the door frame that looked like it had been clawed at, deep gouges in the metal that definitely hadn't been made by human fingernails. "But what if there's an emergency?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that emergencies were probably a regular occurrence here. "Then you deal with it inside," Sarah replied flatly. "The diner provides everything you need to survive the night. Food, water, medical supplies, even weapons if necessary." She pointed to a locked cabinet near the coffee machine, the keys under the register. "But remember, whatever's out there in the wasteland at night, it's got nothing on what happens if you break the rules in here." The third rule made even less sense than the first two, and that was saying something. "The no light rule," Sarah explained as she led me to the main dining area. "Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., you're not allowed to turn on any additional lights. The fluorescents that are already on stay on, but no lamps, no flashlights, no lighter flames, nothing. The darkness in the corners isn't just an absence of light. It's something more. And if you illuminate those dark spaces during the forbidden hours, you'll see things that you really don't want to see." She pointed to the corners of the dining room, and I realized that even with all the overhead lights on, there were areas that remained persistently shadowy. It was as if the darkness there was thick, almost tangible, resisting the artificial illumination like water repelling oil. As I stared into those shadows, I could have sworn I saw something shift just at the edge of my peripheral vision. "The darkness amplifies everything," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "Every sound becomes a threat. Every shadow could be hiding something terrible. But whatever you do, don't try to light it up. The things that hide in those corners prefer the dark. Shine a light on them, and they get angry." "What kind of things?" I whispered, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Sarah's laugh was bitter and hollow. The kind that used to be people. The kind that remember just enough about being human to hate what they'd become. The kind that... She stopped abruptly, glancing around as if she'd said too much. "Just follow the rules. Don't ask questions about what you see or hear. And whatever happens, don't try to help anyone who comes to the door after midnight claiming they need assistance." There were more rules, she explained, but these three were the most important. the ones that would keep me alive through my first night. As she talked, I began to notice other things about the diner that I'd missed during my daytime visits. Scratch marks on the walls that looked too deliberate to be accidental damage. Dark stains on the ceiling that formed patterns too organized to be random water damage. And everywhere, that persistent smell of something burning, though none of the kitchen equipment was in use. "Why do you stay?" I asked Sarah as she showed me how to operate the coffee machine. "If it's this dangerous, why not just quit?" Her hands stilled on the machine's controls, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. "You think I haven't tried? You think any of us want to be here?" She gestured vaguely toward the back office where Mr. Gray had disappeared. "The contract you signed, did you read all of it? The part about the minimum commitment period." I had a sinking feeling as I tried to remember the fine print. "1 week," I said slowly. "1 week minimum," Sarah corrected. "But there are penalties for early termination. Penalties that make facing whatever lurks in those dark corners seem like the safer option." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a series of small, circular scars along her forearm. "They look like bite marks. This is what happens when you try to break your contract. And these are just the visible reminders." The clock on the wall read 11 p.m. exactly. And as if on cue, I heard the distinct sound of locks engaging throughout the building. Multiple locks, from the sound of it, heavy-duty mechanisms that hadn't been visible from the inside. Sarah's expression became even more grim. "It's starting," she said simply. "Remember the rules. Follow them exactly. And whatever you do, don't trust anything that seems too familiar. Sometimes the worst things are the ones that look the most like help." The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then settled into a steady but somehow ominous glow. Outside, the wasteland looked different than it had just moments before, darker, more hostile, as if the very air had become thick with malevolent intent. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear something that sounded almost like singing, a melody that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. My first night shift at Dot's Diner had officially begun, and I was already counting the hours until dawn. The first few hours of my shift passed in relative calm, though calm is a relative term when you're trapped in a diner that seems to exist in its own pocket of nightmare reality. Sarah and I worked in near silence, she handling the prep work while I familiarized myself with the layout and equipment. The coffee machine gurgled and hissed like something alive, and every sound from the kitchen seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet. It was around 1:30 a.m. when Sarah finally began to explain the history behind the rules, her voice barely above a whisper as we cleaned glasses behind the counter. "You want to know why this place is the way it is?" she asked, glancing nervously at the dark corners. "It wasn't always like this. Dot's Diner used to be just another roadside stop. Nothing special about it except decent food and friendly service." She paused to check the clock, still 30 minutes before the no-talking rule would kick in. The problem started about 2 years ago, right around the time the Institute increased their presence in the area. You know about the Institute, right? Those underground scientists with their synthetic humans and their experiments. I nodded. Everyone in the Wasteland had heard rumors about the Institute and their advanced technology, though most people treated them as boogeyman stories told around campfires. "Well, they're real," Sarah continued, "and they were very interested in Dot's Diner. Not the building itself, but its location. See, this spot sits right on top of what used to be a pre-war research facility, something called the Behavioral Sciences Division, part of some government project that was studying human psychology under extreme stress conditions. The pieces began clicking together in my mind, though I wish they wouldn't. They were experimenting on people. Before the war, during the war, and apparently they never really stopped. Sarah's hands were shaking as she polished the same glass for the third time. The Institute found the old research notes, the equipment, everything. They decided to continue the experiments, but they needed subjects. And what better way to get a steady supply of test subjects than to operate a business that people would come to willingly? My blood ran cold. The missing staff you mentioned weren't just missing, Sarah finished. They were taken down into the underground levels that most people don't even know exist. The Institute scientists would study them, experiment on them, try to understand how the human mind breaks under pressure. Some of the subjects died. Others came back changed. She gestured toward the dark corners of the dining room. Those shadows aren't empty. They're full of the people who used to work here, the customers who stayed too late, the travelers who thought they'd found a safe place to rest. The Institute's experiments did something to them, twisted them into something that's not quite human anymore, but not quite gone either. But why the rules? I asked, though part of me was beginning to understand. Why the specific restrictions? Because the experiments are still ongoing, Sarah said, her voice dropping even lower. The Institute realized they didn't need to actively kidnap people anymore. They just needed to create the right conditions, apply the right pressures, and people would break themselves down for study. The rules aren't meant to protect us. They're meant to stress us, to push us to our psychological breaking points so the researchers can observe how we respond. The clock struck 2 a.m., and Sarah immediately fell silent, pointing to the clock and then to her lips. The no-talking rule was now in effect, but her revelations had opened up a horrifying new perspective on everything around me. Those cameras I'd noticed in the corners weren't for security. They were recording our every reaction for analysis. The strange layout of the kitchen, the inexplicable darkness in certain areas, the locked doors and bizarre time restrictions. All of it was designed to create maximum psychological stress. As if summoned by my growing understanding, the first customer of the night appeared at the window. But customer might not be the right word. The figure outside looked human at first glance, but something was off about the proportions, the way it moved, the angle of its head as it peered through the glass. It tapped on the window with what should have been fingers, but the sound was wrong. Too sharp, too metallic. Sarah grabbed my arm and pointed to a laminated card behind the register. Night shift protocols, it read. 1. Acknowledge all window visitors with a nod, but do not invite them inside. 2. If door handles rattle, continue working and do not look directly at the entrances. 3. Serve any entity that successfully enters the building, but maintain minimal eye contact. The thing outside continued tapping, its movements becoming more agitated when we didn't respond. Its face pressed against the glass, and, in the dim reflection, I could see that what I'd taken for a human face was actually something wearing a mask made of human skin, poorly fitted and coming loose at the edges. Sarah nudged me and pointed to another section of the protocol card. Window visitors are former staff members undergoing advanced behavioral modification. They retain some memories of their previous employment and may attempt to return to work. Do not acknowledge their employment history. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the figure outside tilted its head at an impossible angle before shambling away into the darkness. But I could still see it out there, pacing back and forth just beyond the range of the exterior lights, occasionally joined by other shapes that moved with the same unnatural gait. At exactly 2:30 a.m., Sarah led me to a filing cabinet behind the coffee machine and pulled out a thick folder labeled Employee Records. Inside were dozens of photographs and personnel files, dating back to when the diner first opened under Institute management. As I flipped through them, a pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. Every employee's file showed the same progression. They'd start with normal employment photos, smiling faces, neat uniforms, hopeful expressions. But subsequent photos, taken at weekly intervals, showed a gradual deterioration. The smiles became forced, then disappeared entirely. Dark circles appeared under their eyes. Their skin took on a grayish pallor. And in the final photos, something fundamental had changed in their expressions. A vacant, haunted look that suggested the person behind the eyes was no longer entirely present. The files also contained detailed psychological evaluations, tracking each employee's mental state as they were subjected to the night shift rules. Stress levels, sleep deprivation, paranoid ideation, dissociative episodes, all carefully documented and analyzed. The Institute wasn't just running a diner. They were operating a human laboratory, using the night shift as a method of inducing controlled psychological breakdown. But the most disturbing part was the section labeled post-employment status. For most of the files, this section simply read subject terminated or transferred to deep research. But for some, there was a different notation, converted to operational asset. Sarah pointed to one particular file, a young man named David Chun who'd worked the night shift about 6 months ago. His progression photos showed the same deterioration as the others, but his final photo was different. His eyes held an inhuman intelligence, and his smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. In the post-employment status section, someone had written, "Successfully integrated with shadow population, currently assigned to customer interaction duties." I realized with growing horror that the things we've been seeing outside, the figures that tapped on windows and rattled door handles, weren't just failed experiments. They were graduates of the night shift program, employees who'd been broken down and rebuilt into something that served the Institute's purposes. They were what awaited anyone who couldn't survive the psychological pressure of the rules. At 3 a.m., the no-talking rule ended, but Sarah remained silent, staring out at the figures still pacing in the darkness beyond the windows. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow with despair. "Now you understand why I can't leave," she whispered. "It's not just the contract penalties. It's knowing that if I can't handle the stress anymore, I'll end up like them, still working at the diner, but not really human anymore." The Institute calls it employment optimization, taking broken minds and repurposing them for tasks that don't require full consciousness. She pulled out her own employee file, and I saw that she was already several weeks into the deterioration process shown in the other files. Her recent photos showed the same haunted expression, the same gradual loss of vitality that marked all the Institute's test subjects. "The question is," she said, looking directly at me with eyes that held too much terrible knowledge, "how long do you think you can last before you join them?" The night was far from over, and as the clock struck 3:30 a.m., I began to understand that everything I had experienced so far had been merely preparation for what was coming. The real horror of working at Dot's Diner wasn't the rules themselves. It was what happened when those rules brought you face to face with the diner's true clientele. The first genuine customer of the night entered through the front door at exactly 3:45 a.m., though I hadn't heard the door chime or seen anyone approach. One moment the dining area was empty. The next moment a figure sat in the corner booth, perfectly still and staring directly at me. The overhead lights flickered when it appeared, and the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. "That's Mrs. Patterson," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with controlled fear. "She comes in every night around this time, orders the same thing, pays with pre-war money, never speaks above a whisper. She's been coming here for 8 months, but according to the records, she died in that booth 6 months ago." The figure, Mrs. Patterson, raised one pale hand and gestured toward our position behind the counter. Even from across the room, I could see that her movements were wrong somehow, too fluid in some places and too jerky in others, like a marionette being operated by someone who'd only heard puppets described secondhand. "You take this one," Sarah said, giving me a gentle push toward the dining area. "Remember the protocols. Minimal eye contact. Acknowledge requests with nods. Don't engage in conversation even if she tries to start one. And whatever you do, don't look directly at her face for more than a few seconds at a time." I approached the booth with my order pad, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. Up close, Mrs. Patterson looked almost normal. An elderly woman in a faded floral dress, her gray hair neatly arranged, her hands folded on the table. But as I got closer, the details that were wrong became more apparent. Her skin had a waxy quality that reminded me of candles left too long in the sun. Her breathing was too shallow and too regular, like she was consciously remembering to do it. And her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion, as if they were windows into an empty room. The usual, "Please," she said in a voice that sounded like autumn leaves scraping across concrete. I nodded and wrote "usual" on my pad, though I had no idea what that meant. Mrs. Patterson smiled, and I caught a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. Back behind the counter, Sarah was already preparing a plate. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, all of it looking perfectly normal except for the fact that it was stone cold and gave off no aroma whatsoever. "She never eats it," Sarah explained as she handed me the plate. "Just stares at it for exactly 37 minutes. Leaves exact change for 1954 and disappears. The food vanishes with her." I served the meal with hands that I tried to keep steady, and Mrs. Patterson nodded her thanks without looking away from my face. As I walked back to the counter, I could feel her black eyes tracking my movement, and I heard her whisper something that sounded like "soon." But Mrs. Patterson was just the beginning. Over the next hour, the diner filled with customers that defied every law of nature and logic. There was Mr. Gregory, a businessman in a radiation-burned suit who ordered coffee that steamed with green vapor and left scorch marks on the table. He'd apparently been coming to the diner since before the war, though he'd been dead for over 200 years according to the records Sarah showed me. Then came the family, 2 parents and 3 children, who sat in perfect silence at a center table. Their clothing was pristine 1950s suburban wear, but their faces showed the unmistakable signs of severe radiation poisoning. The children colored in books with crayons that left no marks on the paper, while the parents read newspapers whose headlines shifted and changed when you weren't looking directly at them. "Institute experiments," Sarah explained during a brief lull. "They're studying post-mortem psychological patterns, trying to understand how consciousness persists after death. These customers aren't really ghosts. They're echoes, imprints left behind by traumatic experiences and amplified by Institute technology." The most disturbing customer was a young woman who appeared around 4:30 a.m., just as the no-light rule was ending. She looked completely normal at first, maybe 25 years old, wearing jeans and a Vault-Tec t-shirt, with bright eyes and a friendly smile. She ordered pancakes and coffee, made pleasant small talk about the weather, and seemed like the first genuinely human customer I'd encountered all night. But as I served her food, Sarah grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Don't trust her," she hissed. "That's Jennifer Walsh. She used to work the day shift here. She's been dead for 3 weeks." I looked back at Jennifer, who was cutting her pancakes with mechanical precision, each piece exactly the same size as the others. Her friendly smile never wavered, but as I watched, I noticed that she wasn't actually chewing the food, just making the motions of eating while the pancakes seemed to dissolve on contact with her mouth. "The Institute brings them back sometimes," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "Not really alive, but animated. They use them to test how we react to familiar faces, to see if we'll break protocol when confronted with someone we think we recognize. Jennifer was a friend of mine. They're using her corpse to torment me." Jennifer looked up from her meal and waved cheerfully at Sarah, who went white as a sheet and turned away. "Sarah," Jennifer called out in a voice that was just slightly off-pitch from how a living person would sound. "Come sit with me. I have so much to tell you about my new job." Sarah's hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the counter. "She doesn't know she's dead," she whispered. "The Institute's programming makes her think she just got transferred to a different department. She keeps trying to tell me about her new responsibilities in the underground levels. The psychological impact of these encounters was exactly what the Institute was studying, I realized. They weren't just observing how we handled fear or stress. They were documenting how we processed the impossible, how our minds bent, and sometimes broke when confronted with violations of everything we understood about life and death. Throughout the night, cameras mounted in the corners tracked our every movement and reaction. Sometimes I could hear the faint whir of mechanical equipment from behind the walls, recording our vital signs, our stress responses, our gradual psychological deterioration. We weren't employees. We were lab rats, and the night shift was an elaborate maze designed to push us past our breaking points. But the worst part wasn't the supernatural customers or the constant surveillance. It was the growing realization that I was changing, adapting to this nightmare reality in ways that probably weren't healthy. By 5 a.m., I found myself automatically following protocols I had never been explicitly taught, responding to impossible situations with a calm that definitely wasn't natural. When a customer with no face ordered scrambled eggs, I simply nodded and served them without question. When the jukebox started playing music from a radio station that had been off the air for 2 centuries, I didn't even look up from cleaning the counter. Sarah noticed the change too. "It's starting," she said sadly as we watched the sun begin to rise through the windows. "The Institute's conditioning. Your mind is protecting itself by accepting the impossible as normal. It's a survival mechanism, but it's also the first step toward becoming like them." She gestured toward the window, where our former colleagues still paced in the growing daylight. As 6 a.m. approached and the locks disengaged throughout the building, I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something else entirely, a strange reluctance to leave, as if the diner had become more real than the outside world. The wasteland beyond the windows looked harsh and unwelcoming compared to the familiar nightmare I'd grown accustomed to. "That's how they get you," Sarah said, reading the expression on my face. "One night at a time, until the horror becomes home." 6 months have passed since my first night shift at Dot's Diner, and I'm still here, still following the rules, still serving impossible customers, still recording my gradual psychological deterioration for the Institute's research purposes. I know I should leave, should find some way to break free from this nightmare. But the truth is more complicated than simple imprisonment. The diner has become my reality in ways that the outside world no longer can. Out there, in the wasteland, things are unpredictable, chaotic, dangerous in ways that make no sense. But here, within these walls, there are rules, structure, a twisted kind of order that my mind has learned to navigate. The horror has become routine, and routine has become comfort. Sarah lasted another 2 months after my arrival before she finally broke. I watched it happen gradually. The way she started talking to customers who weren't there, the way she began preparing meals for orders that had never been placed, the way her employee photos started showing that telltale vacant expression that marked all the Institute's successful subjects. One morning at 6 a.m., she simply walked out the front door and disappeared into the darkness between the streetlights. She came back 3 days later, tapping on the window with fingers that had grown too long and sharp, wearing the same forced smile as all the other converted staff members. The Institute replaced her with a new trainee, a young man named Marcus who lasted exactly 11 days before joining the shadow population that paces outside our windows each night. After Marcus came Elena, then Robert, then a succession of faces and names that I'm beginning to forget. The turnover rate is accelerating, but somehow I remain, adapting and surviving in ways that probably make me a fascinating case study for the researchers watching from their underground laboratories. I've learned to recognize the different types of customers now, categorizing them by their origins and purposes. There are the echoes, like Mrs. Patterson, who are psychic impressions of traumatic deaths, replaying their final moments in an endless loop. The converted, like Jennifer Walsh, are reanimated corpses programmed with false memories and sent to test our emotional responses. The watchers are something else entirely. Shadowy figures that never order anything, but sit in the dark corners, observing and reporting back to their handlers in ways I don't want to understand. But the most disturbing customers are the ones I've started calling the candidates. These are living people, wastelanders who stumble into the diner looking for shelter or a meal, unaware that they're walking into a recruitment center for the Institute's experimental programs. I'm supposed to serve them normally, but I can see the cameras focusing on them, tracking their reactions, analyzing their psychological profiles. Some of them leave safely at dawn. Others receive job offers from Mr. Gray, who always seems to appear when fresh subjects present themselves. The worst part is that I've stopped trying to warn them. The first few times, I attempted subtle hints, try to communicate the danger through meaningful looks or carefully chosen words. But each attempt was met with punishment. A day locked in a walk-in cooler, a night serving customers with my mouth sealed shut. Once even a brief trip to the underground levels where I saw things that still visit me in my dreams. Eventually, I learned that survival meant complicity, and complicity meant becoming part of the system that had trapped me. Mr. Gray has taken a special interest in my case. He visits more frequently now, appearing during the deepest part of the night shift to observe my interactions with the customers. Sometimes he brings colleagues, men and women in white coats who speak in medical terminology and take notes on tablets that glow with an unnatural blue light. They discuss me as if I'm not there, analyzing my adaptation patterns and stress response evolution, like I'm a particularly interesting specimen in a jar. Subject demonstrates remarkable resilience. I heard one of them say during a recent visit, psychological breaking point appears significantly higher than average population. Recommend extending observation period before proceeding to conversion protocols. Conversion protocols. I know what that means now, having seen the process happen to others. It's not just death and reanimation. It's a gradual replacement of human consciousness with something else, something that serves the Institute's purposes without the inconvenience of free will or moral concerns. The converted employees don't suffer because they no longer have the capacity for suffering. They don't rebel because rebellion requires a sense of self that has been systematically erased. But here's the thing that keeps me awake during my daylight hours. I'm not sure I'd mind the conversion anymore. The constant stress, the nightly horror, the knowledge that I'm complicit in unspeakable experiments. It all weighs on me in ways that make the empty contentment of the converted seem almost appealing. What would it be like to serve the impossible customers without feeling fear? To follow the rules without understanding their terrible purpose? To exist without the burden of memory or conscience? The diner has taught me that there are worse things than death, but also that there might be worse things than becoming something that isn't quite human anymore. Every night, as I watch my former colleagues pace outside the windows, I wonder if they found a kind of peace in their conversion. They don't look tortured or suffering, just empty, purposeful, free from the psychological torment that defines my existence. New employees still arrive regularly, brought by the same desperation that led me to this place. I train them now, reciting the rules with the same mechanical precision that Sarah once used. I watch them go through the same stages of realization, horror, acceptance, and gradual breakdown that I experienced. Some adapt as I did. Most don't. But all of them contribute to the Institute's research in one way or another. The latest trainee is a woman named Alice, maybe 40 years old, with haunted eyes that suggest she's already seen more than her share of Wasteland horrors. She's been working the night shift for 3 weeks now, and I can see the familiar signs of deterioration beginning to manifest. The forced smiles, the nervous glances at the cameras, the way she flinches when the impossible customers make their impossible requests. Last night, during a brief break in the customer flow, she asked me the same question that every trainee eventually asks. How do you stand it? How do you keep going when everything about this place is wrong. I looked at her with eyes that I know have developed the same vacant quality that marked all my predecessors, and I gave her the only honest answer I could. You stop thinking of it as wrong. You stop thinking of it as anything at all. You just follow the rules and serve the customers and count the hours until dawn. After a while, it becomes as natural as breathing. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Part of me still remembers what it felt like to be fully human, still recoils from the horrors I witnessed nightly, still mourns for the person I used to be before Dot's Diner claimed me. That part is getting smaller each night, worn away by the constant exposure to impossibility, but it's not gone yet. Maybe that's why the Institute keeps me around. Maybe I'm more valuable as a partially broken test subject than I would be as another mindless converted employee. Maybe my ongoing deterioration provides data that complete conversion couldn't offer. Or maybe they're just waiting for the right moment, the perfect psychological pressure point, to complete my transformation into something that serves their purposes without question. The sun is rising now, painting the wasteland in shades of amber and rust. In a few minutes, the locks will disengage, and I'll be free to leave for another day. But freedom is a relative concept when you know you'll be back tonight, and the night after that, and every night thereafter until something fundamental inside you finally snaps. Alice is cleaning tables in the dining area, her movements still showing traces of human revulsion when she encounters the stains left by our supernatural clientele. Give her another month, and she'll clean those stains with the same mechanical efficiency I've developed. Give her 2 months, and she'll stop seeing them as stains at all. The door chimes as the first daytime customer enters, a normal human being looking for coffee and breakfast before continuing their journey through the wasteland. Alice serves them with a smile that's only slightly forced, making small talk about road conditions and weather patterns. The customer has no idea that they're being served by someone who spent the night catering to the dead and the converted. No idea that the woman taking their order is slowly losing pieces of her humanity with each passing shift. But that's the true horror of Dot's Diner. It's not the supernatural customers or the impossible rules or even the Institute's experiments. It's the way it makes the unthinkable seem normal, the way it transforms ordinary people into willing participants in their own destruction. It's a machine that runs on human souls, powered by desperation and sustained by the gradual erosion of everything that makes us who we are. And the worst part, looking back at these 6 months, knowing what I know about what this place has done to me and to everyone who's worked here, I still can't imagine leaving. The diner has become my identity, my purpose, my entire world. Outside these walls, I'm just another wasteland survivor struggling to make sense of a broken world. But here, following the rules and serving the customers, I have a role to play in something larger than myself, even if that something is fundamentally evil. The clock strikes 6 a.m., and my shift officially ends. Tomorrow night, I'll be back, ready to train another new employee, or serve another impossible customer, or follow another rule that pushes me further from humanity and closer to whatever the Institute wants me to become. And someday, when my psychological breaking point is finally reached, I'll walk out that front door and join the shadow population pacing in the darkness, finally free from the burden of consciousness, but forever bound to this place that has defined and consumed me. Until then, I'll keep following the rules, keep serving the customers, and keep counting the nights until my transformation is complete. Because in the end, Dot's Diner doesn't just serve food to travelers passing through the wasteland. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we become willingly, one shift at a time. The door chimes again as I prepare to leave, and I turn back for one last look at the diner that has become my prison and my home. Alice is still serving the normal customer, her smile growing more natural as she falls into the rhythm of regular human interaction. But I can see the cameras in the corners adjusting their focus, tracking her movements, analyzing her responses, preparing for another night of carefully orchestrated horror. And somewhere in the underground levels beneath our feet, the Institute researchers are already planning the next phase of their experiments, the next refinement of their human-breaking machinery, the next set of rules designed to transform ordinary people into willing participants in their own destruction. Welcome to Dot's Diner, where every meal is an adventure and every employee eventually becomes part of the menu.